Welcome to Indigenous History Now. I'm working on the research for the next history video, so what we're going to do today is start our exploration of Indigenous languages, beginning with a series on language analysis. Now, what is language analysis? What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you a bit of my personal history with language to give you an idea of what I hope to accomplish with this series. You guys have all heard that joke, right? What do you call someone who speaks two languages bilingual? What do you call someone who speaks one? American? Yeah, that was me until college. I started learning in college a couple of Indigenous languages. I'm interested in language revitalization, and my first was Lushootseed, which is the language of the Puget Sound in Washington. I was going to the University of Washington at the time, and I lived in Washington for over 10 years, and my second is Hawaiian. And with both cases, I had a teacher, a mentor that I was working with that really helped me out. They were, the cornerstone of my studying and learning capability, but I didn't live that close to them, so I couldn't always have good contact with them. And in both cases, I didn't have access to a fluent speaking community. And as anybody who studied a second language before knows, the best environment for learning that language is a community of speakers where you can converse in the language with them, and they can converse in the language with you, and you can hear it in a conversational setting and use it in a conversational setting. But unfortunately, a lot of us don't have access to a setting like that. So what do? Well, you're not completely out of luck. What I did was a lot of my studying was self-taught and self-directed, and with the guidance of my mentors, of course. And another thing that I ran into in my studies, especially with Lushootseed, because Lushootseed doesn't have any fluent speakers right now. It's dormant. So most of the material we're working with is written and analyzed by linguists. So I'm trying to study this language, and I have to wade through these depths of all this linguistic jargon that I never studied language before. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I didn't know what an agent and a patient means. So I actually switched one of my degrees from history to linguistics so I could understand what I was doing. And so I adopted a explicitly grammatical approach. Now, what do I mean by that? When most of us Americans hear the word grammar, we kind of chill with fear because our experience with that word is someone telling us, say something this way, don't say it that way, this is right, and you're wrong. That's what we call in linguistics prescriptive grammar. How to talk right, Speak well, they would probably say. That's not what we're concerned with in linguistics. What we're concerned with in linguistics is what we call descriptive grammar. Descriptive grammar is the nuts and bolts of how a language works. The scaffolding, the skeleton that holds all the fleshy bits together. How is it that a person can speak just a continuous stream of sound, or in sign language, they can be signing a continuous stream of signs, and someone can see or hear that and parse it apart and form it in their minds into a sequence of meaning, some communication. How is it that we can understand each other when we're talking to each other? That's the role of grammar. The grammar of a language lets your brain know how all these pieces fit together and how, when you change one thing here, it affects a meaning over there, how all of that works. That's grammar. So what I adopted was an approach of trying to understand that grammar in the languages that I was studying, trying to build that scaffolding in my head so that then I just needed to study the vocabulary. I would get to the point where I knew how all the puzzle pieces fit together, and then all you need to do is just grab the puzzle piece and stick it in place. Consequently, today, especially with my Hawaiian, the way I study is I just read with a dictionary next to me because I know how everything fits together. Even if I come across a word in a sentence that I don't know, even just by looking at it because of where it is in the sentence and how the sentence is structured, I can already narrow down its meaning and what it's doing in the sentence to, 3 or 4 different slots that I could be fitting into. And then I just need to look up the meaning and put it in place. So while nothing, especially to get to fluency, nothing can beat the absolute cream of the crop of a immersion environment or a speaking community environment, it doesn't mean you can't get off the ground. And it doesn't mean that you can't get to a good level of conversation and comprehension without that sort of community. So that's what I hope to do with this series is people who are interested in language in generally are going to be interested in it, and it's going to be a good resource for them and a good resource for anybody who's trying to learn a second language, but especially for those of us who are trying to do that without a speaking community or without a lot of time around a speaking community, where most of the time you're having to do it by yourself, maybe with a couple family members and friends. I specifically want to give those people the tools to build that scaffolding of language in their heads. So how are we going to do that? Well, first, we're going to do an overview of all the different major fields of language that are going to be useful to this process. We're going to start today with phonetics, which is the sounds of a language. And how do we make those sounds? And how do we hear those sounds? Then we're going to go to phonology, which is the intersection between sound and meaning. Then we're going to go to morphology, which is the way that words are broken up into smaller bits of meaning. Then syntax, which is the way that words fit together in a sentence. Then semantics, which is the exploration of meaning. And pragmatics, which is the way that cultural and environmental non-linguistic factors affect how we interpret a piece of communication and what that means to us. There are other fields of linguistics that we could delve into as well, and we'll probably do that over time, but those are going to be our core 6. And then after that, what I want to do is go in 2 different directions. I want to go in one direction of exploring different features of language and how they appear, especially in Indigenous languages. Like, what is a relative clause and what does that do? What is a subjunctive? What is tense, aspect, and mood? What are all these things? And go more detail into those. And then also I want to do language profiles, case studies of languages. I take a language and I analyze it, and I go through the sounds and the morphology and the syntax and all those nuts and bolts and give you some examples. I'll start with the languages that I know. But if you in the audience have an Indigenous language that you want me to do a case study on, drop it down in the comments and I'll do that. It won't be a quick turnaround time on those, though. I want to do a really good job of them. I want to give you a good, useful resource, not just some video made off of 2 weeks of research. I will take my time with those, but I will get to them. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's delve into it. Phonetics. What is language, and how is it made? What we're concerned with here is what's called your vocal tract. Air comes out of your lungs, it passes through your vocal cords, and then it goes out your oral and nasal cavities. And that whole system acts like an instrument. Your vocal cords vibrate, and your vocal tract acts like a resonator. And the shape of your vocal tract affects the quality of the sound as it's coming through that resonator. And those different sound qualities as they come out are what make different sounds. Sound in linguistics is a very problematic term because it can mean like 5 different things. And we'll piece that apart more in the phonology video. That's where it's going to be more important. But we're concerned with the sounds that languages use to distinguish meaning, and the sounds that languages use as part of their language components. Things like coughs and sneezes and burps, and we're not concerned with those. Those aren't linguistic. We're concerned with any sounds that are used as components of language. There are 3 different fields we're concerned with in phonetics. There's articulatory phonetics, which is what I just described. This whole mechanism of the nuts and bolts of what is involved in producing the sounds of language. And number 2, there's acoustic phonetics. This whole system operates as a source and a filter, as a resonator. What comes out is sound, vibrations in the air. So acoustic phonetics is concerned with those actual vibrations in the air, the sound waves that come out of our speech. And then there's auditory phonetics, which is those sound waves hit our eardrums, and those eardrums send a signal to the brain, and the brain then has to interpret that information. So how the brain interprets that information is auditory phonetics. And there can be a difference between the exact sound as it is produced acoustically and the sound that is as it is perceived auditorily. This is an important distinction to make. We'll run across it a couple times in this video and in subsequent videos. A tool that is going to be very useful to you is called the International Phonetic Alphabet. Languages with writing systems, most of the time, especially if they have recently developed a writing system, the point of the writing system is to be largely faithful to the pronunciation of the language. But this doesn't always happen. We're English speakers. We know this very well. You can knight somebody at night who is traveling through the forest and having to bend under tree boughs. You get what I'm saying. How a language is written is called orthography. Orthography is not always a perfect reflection of pronunciation. So linguists came up with a system called the International Phonetic Alphabet. And what this does is represent the sounds of language as an individual segment. Every symbol is just one segment of sound. Now, of course, language is not perfectly segmented into individual chunks of sound as we produce language. They flow together and they affect each other. It's a constant stream of acoustics that our mind is then chunking apart and segmenting apart into different auditory units. See right there, the difference between acoustics and auditory. So it's not going to be a perfect, reflection of exact pronunciation, but it's going to be a very helpful guide. So let's go through it and let's learn all the nuts and bolts. Starting with consonants. Don't mind if I'm looking over here. I've got it pulled up right here. I'm going to show you two different charts of the IPA. One of them is the official chart, and that one is it's very succinct, which is nice. It's very easy to understand. This one here that I'm looking at is pulled off the Wikipedia page. It has a bunch of symbols in it that aren't their own IPA symbol, and you'll see the difference between the two of them. I'm going to use it and show it, though. It shows a lot more of the possible sounds in language than the other one does, which is nice. Or not even just the more possible sounds, but more of the sounds that are used, which is nice. It's a little bit more detailed. So even though it might be a little cluttered, I like how detailed it is. So you can see, first thing, there are white boxes and there are gray boxes. The gray boxes are sounds that the human vocal tract cannot produce. I don't know what's going on there with that voiced fell or flap, though, but gray boxes are sounds that the vocal tract cannot produce. White boxes are sounds that they can produce. If there is an empty spot in a white box, it means that it is theoretically possible for the vocal tract to produce this sound. We just have not come across a human language that uses that sound. So the IPA tries to be a faithful reflection of not just what's possible, but what is used, what is actualized in human language. Now, what's the difference between a consonant and a vowel? Both are produced by the way the vocal tract is shaped as the resonator, as the resonating chamber, changing the quality of that sound wave that comes through it. But essentially, consonants are more restricted than vowels are. I can produce a bunch of vowel sounds and my mouth is pretty open the whole time. I, oo, o, and I can glide between them. I'm just continually gliding between vowel sounds because the mouth is very open. There's very little restriction going on in there. Compare that to consonant sounds. P, t, k, g, d. I can't glide between those. P, t, k, d, d, b. I can't glide between that because there's much more restriction there. Consonants are much more segmented than vowels are. So how do we define a consonant? There are three main features that we use to define a consonant. Place of articulation, which is where in the mouth, where in the vocal tract, the constriction in the airstream is happening. How sounds are produced is a relationship between what's called an active articulator and a passive articulator. Active articulator, typically your tongue, is a part of the mouth that moves to meet up with a passive articulator, which is typically lots of things along the roof of your vocal tract, your oral tract mostly. So how these sounds are defined, the place of articulation is the place where the active articulator is meeting the passive articulator. There's manner of articulation, which is how the vocal tract is constricting that airstream. And then there is voicing, which is whether or not your vocal cords are moving or not. There are a couple of other features that are also present in consonants, but those are the three big ones. That's how we pretty much define what a consonant is. We describe them by voicing, place, and manner. So a k, what we use as a K in English, is a voiced velar stop. That's how we describe it technically. B is a voiced bilabial stop. A S is a voiceless alveolar fricative. See? You can break all these consonant sounds apart into these chunks and define every one of them. So let's go through them. At the end of this list, voice, place, manner, we'll start at the end at manner. So let's start with the top two. It says nasal and plosive. We'll skip ahead to the second line. What is a plosive? This is also called a stop. A stop is when your vocal tract is completely closed off. There's nowhere for the air to escape. You can't hold on to these because the airstream is not flowing. You don't hear the sound until you release the stop. B, k, t, d. Those are all stop sounds. Now, what they call a plosive, most people just call it a stop. You'll see that a lot in the literature. Plosive is a perfectly acceptable word too. You can also define it as an oral stop, in contrast with a nasal stop. And that's the first row here. Nasal stops are usually just called nasals. Oral stops are usually just called stops or plosives. What's the difference? Well, you can see here, we'll go through some mouth anatomy later. In the back of your throat is what's called the soft palate or the velum. And that can move to either close the nasal cavity or open the nasal cavity. With most sounds, that is closed. So you only have the oral tract to work with. Now you can open it for pretty much anything, and nasalization of typically oral features is a pretty common thing. Or nasal stops are stops that have the velum open. The oral tract is completely closed, like a stop, but the nasal tract is open, allowing the sound to escape. The M sound, is a nasal. And actually, if you make the M sound with me and put your finger underneath your nose, you can hear the air, you can feel the air coming out. And you can tell the difference between an M and a B. You can see they're both being produced with my lips, but I can hold on to one and I can't on the other. Because on one, air is moving at a constant stream. The M, the voice nasal stop, because it's coming through my nasal cavity. Then we have our fricatives, and this again divides it into two chunks, the sibilant and the non-sibilant fricative. So a fricative is the vocal tract is just a little bit more open than a stop. Air is continuously going through. It's not a stop. It's not completely cutting off the airflow, but it's such a narrow passage that there's a lot of friction in the air, hence the name fricative. And you can see that fricatives are a very commonly used manner of articulation. These are your f, s, sh, zh, z. Those are all good, healthy fricative sounds. And you can see they divide them into two. We can tell that there's a little bit of a difference between those. We got some fricatives that are sharper and harsher than others. And so those sharp and harsh ones, we call them sibilants. Those are what we call your S sounds. You can see those are all really harsh sounds compared to those are a lot less harsh. So those are non-sibilant fricatives. Then they go to what's called an approximant. You're going to come across a lot of different terms for this one. Glide, liquid, approximant, semivowel. Those are all 4 different terms that mean the same thing. This manner of articulation. Now, What it is, the last of those, the semivowel, kind of gives it away. The mouth is so open that it's just on the verge of becoming a vowel. These are things like y, those are all approximants. Then there's something called a tap or a flap. What's going on here, your tongue is literally flicking the roof of your mouth. Technically, the difference between a tap or a flap is the direction that it flicks. In one, it flicks back to front, in the other, it flicks front to back. And a tap, for those of us who speak American English, the T in water is a flap. We're not saying water, it's not a full stop. We're not saying water, it's not a full stop. We're saying water, water. You can feel your tongue flicking against the roof of your mouth. And this produces a very brief stop sound, just a split second of a stop sound before it's released. So we go from tap to trill. Trill is, in American English, we're most exposed to rolled R's. Those are all trill sounds. Now a trill is, you have more restriction than a tap, so that the series of stop closures is dragged on. The difference between a tap and a trill, you can't continue a tap. You have to do individual segments of a tap. You can't hold it. You can't do that with a tap. You can only do that with a trill. And then they have a bunch of columns here called lateral. Now, the sound can either come over the middle of your tongue, which are central sounds, or it can be released around the sides of your tongue. Those are lateral sounds. Things like, if you do an L, you can see your tongue in the middle is touching the roof of your mouth, but sound is still getting out because it's being released around the sides. So that's a lateral. And here it's got some examples of a lateral fricative, lateral approximant, lateral flap. Don't ask me to pronounce that. If you guys want, I can make a video where I go through all the different sounds in the IPA and I pronounce them. Give me time to do that though. I will need to practice. But I will do that if you want. So that's all the manners of articulation for a consonant. Now let's go place of articulation. You can see at the front here it's called bilabial. This is produced with your two lips together. B, m, p. Then there's labiodental. This is your bottom lip against your top teeth. F, v. Then you have linguolabial. This is not used in very many languages, but it is present in some Indigenous American languages. You take your tongue and you put it against your top lip. The. Then you have what's called dental, also called interdental. Now, this is, your tongue is against the back of your top row of teeth. It can also be between your teeth. That's how I say the th. You can see I'm putting my tongue, I'm a very harsh interdental speaker that way. But interdental can either be between the teeth or tongue to the back of your top teeth. Then it's what's called alveolar. So if you stick your finger in your mouth, you can feel just behind your teeth there's a ridge before your mouth goes flat. That ridge is called the alveolar ridge. And lots of sounds are produced against the alveolar ridge. S, d, t, r, sh. All of those sounds are produced against the alveolar ridge. That's, as you can see, probably one of the most common places of articulation. The flat part of your mouth behind the alveolar ridge is called the palate. Just behind the alveolar ridge, just before you get onto the palate, is the post-alveolar place of articulation. This is sometimes also called palato-alveolar because it's the ridge between your alveolar ridge and your palate. You know, if the alveolar ridge is a mountain and the palate is a valley, post-alveolar is the foothills. This is primarily the place of sh and zh. So then you have retroflex sounds. What a retroflex is you're taking your tongue and you're actually curling it back like that. That's actually how I say my R's. I had a hard time pronouncing R's when I was young, so while most people have an alveolar R, I have a retroflex R. If any of you are familiar with Russian, The difference between sha and sha, one is alveolar and one is retroflex. Sha, sha. Your tongue is actually, it's curled back on itself. Going a little bit back further, like I said, the flat ridge, the flat part on the top of your mouth is called your palate. Your palate is divided into two parts. The front part of the palate, there's a bone behind it. So this is also called the hard palate. And the back part of the palate is just a bunch of, squishy flesh. And that's called the soft palate. This is the part that moves up and down to make nasals or orals. The hard palate is typically just called the palate. And the soft palate is typically called the velum. So palatal sounds are sounds produced against your hard palate. Then you have velar, and this is against the velum or the soft palate. This is where you have your k, g, ch, g. And you have uvular. The uvula is the tip of the velum. That's that little dangly thing that hangs in the back of your throat. That's the uvula. That's where we have sounds like k, g, h. And we go back more in the mouth. And you can see on this chart it says pharyngeal or epiglottal. Now, we used to draw a distinction between pharyngeal sounds, which were produced with the tongue against the back of the throat, and epiglottal sounds. There's a little tiny flap down there at the bottom of your throat, just before your vocal cord, just above your vocal cord, is called the epiglottis. And so the epiglottis against the back of the throat was for epiglottal sounds. We have in recent years combined these two because we've realized that languages don't really draw a distinction between them. It's more of a difference in pronunciation, which one languages are using, whether they're using the tongue or the epiglottis, but meaning-wise, languages aren't drawing it. So basically, pharyngeal sounds are sounds that are produced with the tongue or the epiglottis against the back of the throat. If any of you are familiar with Arabic, this is your ha, like Ahmed, and this is your Ghain, Gomar, Gharabi. We also see some pharyngeal sounds in certain Indigenous American languages too. And then you have glottal, and this is your actual vocal cords themselves. That's called the glottis. And you can see, the further back we get in the throat, there are less and less sounds we can make. There's less and less we can do to play around with the articulation back there. Glottal sounds are the most common of which is the glottal stop. And this occurs in lots of Indigenous languages that I know. In English, we use it, but it's not used to distinguish meaning. Uh-oh, nuh-uh. That's a glottal stop that you're producing there. It's just the stop. The sound just stops. Okay, that's manner, that's place, voicing. As you can see, each of these manners and places of articulation has a pairing. The one on the left is voiceless, and the one on the right is voiced. What does that mean? Go ahead with me. Take your hand, put it against the base of your throat, and go s, k, g, k, g, b, p. You can feel that sometimes your vocal cords are vibrating and sometimes they are not. When they are not vibrating, that is voiceless. When they are vibrating, that is voiced. Now, voicing is a little more technical than that. And so I'm going to explain voice onset time before we end this video. Because it circles back to the acoustic versus auditory divide. Voicing is not exactly whether or not your vocal tracts are folded. Voicing has a feature called voice onset time. It's usually defined with stops, but it can be defined with other things. What voice onset time is where in relation to the release of the stop do the vocal cords start vibrating. If you look at actual acoustic measurements of this, you will see that even when you're producing a voiced stop or a voiced sound, most of the time the voicing actually starts milliseconds after the stop is released. It's not during the stop itself most of the time. So the difference between what is a voiced stop and what is a voiceless stop, if in both instances the vocal cords aren't actually vibrating at the moment that the stop is released, is simply the length of time between which the stop is released and the voicing starts. Voiced stops are usually very briefly after the stop release. Voiceless stops are significantly longer after the stop release. That's the difference. Now, here's the important thing. Languages differ on when they activate that voicing. Languages differ with voice onset time. And this can affect people's perception of the voicing or voicelessness of a stop. Languages, of course, we all are familiar with this. Languages use different sound inventories. And your brain trains itself to be more familiar with the sounds that your language uses and less familiar with the sounds that it doesn't use. This is why you can come across a speaker of a different language and they can be pronouncing two different sounds in their language and you don't hear a difference. Or you can be pronouncing two different sounds in your language and they don't hear a difference because their brain is attuned to listening to only the sounds that their language deems as important. Now, no fret. Just because your brain forgot sound distinction doesn't mean you can't teach it that way as an adult. You know, adults learn to speak new languages all the time and they learn to pronounce things correctly all the time. But that's another good example of this acoustic versus auditory divide. Somebody can be acoustically producing a sound that you're not auditorily familiar with, and auditorily, you will not perceive it as a different sound until you train your brain to perceive it that way. The same is going on here with voice onset time. Your brain trains itself to be familiar with the interpretation of the VOT of your given language. So, some languages do start their voicing even before or just at the time of stop release. Some start it a tiny bit after, some start it way bit after, and then some even have another distinction where they start it a long time after. And this is where we have something called aspiration. English does aspiration if you say pot versus spot. Pot, spot. You can hear between the stop and the vowel. Pot, spot. Pot, spot. In one of them, I am inserting a breath of air, an aspiration, and in another, I am not. The aspirated one has a much longer VOT than the unaspirated one. Now, most languages make a simple two-way divide, voiced or unvoiced. Some languages make a three-way divide, voiced, voiceless, and aspirated. And where these lines are all drawn affects how people perceive them. So, for example, if a language has the line between voiced and voiceless significantly earlier than another language, say English, well then an English speaker can hear that person pronouncing a P, pronouncing a voiceless stop, and interpret it almost as a B, as a voiced stop, because their voice onset time for voiceless sounds is much closer to the English voice onset time for voiced sounds. For example, if I say something like but, kind of hard for an English speaker to tell whether I'm pronouncing a P or a B. I am in fact pronouncing a P. I'm just pronouncing it with a very short voice onset time. And this has tripped up English speakers before. Hawaiian, for example, does not have a B in its language, in its sound inventory. It sometimes uses a B in the alphabet, mostly in the Bible. But when Westerners first started coming over to Hawaii and transcribing the language, they were very confused as to whether there was just a P or a P and a B, because Hawaiian has a much shorter voice onset time than English does. So they thought they were hearing a B when in fact they were just hearing a P the whole time. Acoustics versus auditory. VOT is a little bit technical. Most people don't need to understand it. I just mention it to get you familiar with you could be hearing something one way when in fact it's being said another, because your brain is trained to hear through the filter of your language. There are a couple more things we need to talk about. Not every feature of a consonant can be represented neatly in this two-dimensional realm, so we're going to have to go on to another one. This other table here, this table is Affricates. So, what is an affricate? You may have noticed on this last table, we didn't even talk about sounds like ch or j. That's because those involve two different manners of articulation very quickly. So what an affricate is, typically happens at the same place of articulation, but it can change, but typically it's the same. And you start with one manner of articulation with a stop, and then you instantly switch to a fricative. Tss, the TS sound, tss, That's literally what it is. It's going from a T to an S instantly. Tss. The CH sound, ch. It's going from our voiceless alveolar stop to our voiceless post-alveolar fricative. Ch. Very quickly. Now, lots of different combinations of sounds can be made into an affricate, and most of the time you'll see this as two symbols with like a tie bar over them, like here, like this table does. I'm just using this table because, like I said, it shows not just what's possible, but a lot of what's used. That's where we're going to cut it for today. That was the phonetics of consonants. Next time we'll come back for the phonetics of vowels. If you guys like my content, want to keep following it in the loop, please do like, subscribe, hit that notification button, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Let me know language-wise if there's anything you want me to cover. And I will see you next time.